I'd like to congratulate the efforts of the Australian Consumer Fraud Task Force. I think bringing to the forefront and highlighting the impact and the harms of mass marketing fraud is a very important job, and then having a response to that. It's also a welcome opportunity for me to tell you something about my agency, the National Fraud Authority in the UK, because it's rather a unique organisation, and I know there's a bit of interest in what we do, why it became about. And it's quite a new organisation, formed only 2 or 3 years ago. And then I want to move on to critically assess the role of awareness raising in fighting fraud. So it seems like a bit like biting the hand that feeds to come out here in Consumer Fraud Awareness Week, but I think it's also time to kind of have a bit of a critical expose of the real role of consumer awareness. But spend first of all a little bit of time on the National Fraud Authority. We were formed just in 2008 after our Attorney General had been put under some pressure to look at how the UK responded to fraud as a crime. There was some well-known cases of our Serious Fraud Office taking many years to bring trials to court and then losing them. We had issues on British Aerospace recently where our track record on corruption and overseas corruption hadn't been particularly good, and it was quite well known that there was a fragmented response to fraud in the UK with a number of bodies that could investigate fraud, and particularly with gaps within the landscape. So some types of fraud crimes would fall between the cracks of agencies. So the Attorney General brought together a team from different agencies to really examine what the response was and come up with recommendations. The recommendations were that there were 4 pillars of a new response. The first was to create a strategic authority which would try to facilitate and coordinate the fragmented landscape. Secondly was to bring in a single place to report fraud, an intelligence bureau and a lead force for fraud. Our job first of all was to develop the first ever national fraud strategy, and this spanned both the public and private sectors to look at what should be the approach across the economy to tackling fraud. So we're not a law enforcement agency. It wasn't about increasing the capacity to go after the bad guys. It was about seeing how we could ensure that our response was a more strategic one. So we're a coordinator and facilitator rather than a law enforcement agency. And we have one mission. If we had white vans that went round, it would be to make the UK a more hostile place for fraudsters. So that's really our mission. Everything we do is to try to make the UK more hostile so fraudsters can't easily get away with what I think for many of them has been a low risk and high profit activity in the past. So I told you about the 4 pillars. The National Fraud Authority. Action Fraud is the name that we call our National Fraud Reporting Centre. So that's our public-facing call centre I'll tell you a bit about in a minute. A first ever National Fraud Intelligence Bureau where all intelligence on fraud goes into one place. And because we didn't have a particularly good response from police forces who are under enormous pressures on all sorts of different crimes, that we set one police force to be a national lead force which would develop capability, would have a role in actually help to train and improve the capacity for all the other police forces. And that's the City of London Police, who had particular expertise in city crime. We set ourselves 4 strategic priorities. First of all, about building and sharing knowledge, and the way we've done that is around measuring fraud, and I'll tell you something about our annual fraud indicator. Secondly, to tackle the most serious and harmful fraud threats. So we have 4 directorates, and that's the job that I do in the National Fraud Authority, thinking how we can take multi-agency approaches to tackle the most harmful fraud threats. And at the moment we have about 5 or 6 projects on identity thefts and identity fraud as an enabler of many different types of frauds, on mass marketing fraud because of its impact on individuals, which I'll go into in a bit more detail, on telecoms fraud because so much of that fraud goes into the hands of organised crime, and on mortgage fraud, which is costing the UK economy between £1 and £2 billion a year. And I think we've seen the impacts of mortgage fraud within the world slowdown and the credit crunch, which are all originated in people being encouraged to make false claims for mortgages in America. Thirdly, it's around disrupting and punishing more fraudsters. So this is around improving the criminal justice response in the UK to fraud, to make it a more seriously treated a crime problem by police and the judiciary, and this has included developing new sentencing guidelines so that there are escalators, for example, if a fraud has an identity theft element, so there's more sentences go towards that type of crime. And we are starting to see the sentences going up for fraud offences. And improving the support for their victims. And I think it's very crucial that we set a strategic priority, because for an agency, an organisation, that means it follows that you'll take some action around your priorities and you're held to account to them. So at the centre of each of our projects, we think about how are we going to do and what we need to do to improve support for victims. And lastly, improving the nation's long-term capability to prevent fraud is around a number of projects, such as ensuring that there are common standards and high standards of fraud investigation, both in the public and private sector. Particularly if in the private sector we can get investigations to a certain standard passed over to the police, so they have to just do the more easy job, really, pinching them, interviewing them and having the evidence there. Just giving the police anything in the past, here's some complaints for fraud, looks a bit complex, clearing off, meant it probably went bottom drawer most occasions. And also about looking at the funded units, specialist funded units, for where we can get the private sector who might be victims of crime to say, if you want us to be investigating more crimes in the insurance industry or the mortgage industry, you come up to the plate and pay for units of police officers to investigate this. So we've been looking into a number of new units. Told you that our first objective was around increasing our knowledge about fraud. And we do this through the annual fraud indicator. Our second annual fraud indicator has quite an ambitious fraud measurement programme. Nothing had really been done about this in the UK. There had been some kind of finger in the air estimates. The first one had been by a criminologist, Dr. Mike Levy, for our Association of Chief Police Officers 2 or 3 years ago, which had been estimated about 14 billion. Well, we did our first measurement exercise last year, and it was something around 30 billion. This year it's gone up to 38.4 billion. But that doesn't, not perhaps a reflection of increase in fraud, but a better knowledge of what the fraud problem is. If you can make out the circle over there, at the moment 55% of the losses that we've detected are in the public sector. This is mainly the tax gap. This is criminal attacks against the tax system and those people not paying their taxes. About $1 billion for social security welfare payment fraud. And it's interesting to perhaps even make the parallel that if you ask most people what's the fraud problem against the public sector, they'll say it's probably welfare cheats, and you see that in the newspapers. 15 times as much is being taken by corporations and others who don't pay their full tax share, and criminals who attack the system. And then we have around about a third which is in the private sector, from different sectors who have admitted to, or we've managed to do surveys and measurement exercises. About 1.3 billion for charities and about 4 billion for against individuals. Until recently, we saw that fraud against the individual has been described as a silent crime, and I think that's because there's been little focus placed upon fraud victims. There's been a lack of reporting by individuals. There's an under-recording, and there are good reasons for this. I think under-reporting, that a lot of people, particularly of mass marketing frauds, feel culpable in some way, that they've got involved in some scheme, and therefore there's certain embarrassment. I think for small businesses to admit that they've been a victim of fraud can create issues of trust around their organisations. We find that there was a problem of real difficulty of knowing who to actually report a fraud to, and there was some research where there's a bit of a merry-go-round where someone who tried to report a fraud might go to the police and say, that looks like a civil matter, mate. Go to another agency, go to a consumer agency, says that's a criminal matter, definitely not for us, you better go somewhere else, and ending up coming back to the same place and then perhaps giving up actually reporting fraud. And perhaps also a view from authorities that it's not even a criminal offence at all, there's no real offence there. And so we've been trying to change that whole contemplation around victims of fraud and trying to improve the reporting, trying to get over the embarrassment factor, and also improving support to victims as well. how we've gone around supporting victims of fraud is we, first of all, thought we had to get to know more about the impacts and the needs of fraud victims. So we commissioned research by the University of Portsmouth, which was a review of the existing landscape and the literature around what we knew about victims of fraud, but then also an ambitious primary research talking to nearly 800 victims. 40 were face-to-face and 750 were a survey, telephone survey, to find out what the impacts were and what their needs were. And I think this is always crucial. I think, speaking to an issue of criminology, that those who are responsible for designing the interventions into defeating crime start off with a much better understanding of what we're trying to achieve, what are the problems we're trying to achieve. So the 4 things that the victims told us, that they didn't know where to report fraud. So we then decided that the response to that was to have a single place to report fraud, and that's Action Fraud, our National Fraud Reporting Centre. The secondly, that they receive less practical advice and support than victims of other crimes, is that we built into our Action Fraud website, into our training of our call takers, training around the 30 most prevalent fraud types. And we went to experts in the area who knew about the fraud types. So Boiler Room Investment Scams, our Financial Services Authority, for example, they had experts who knew about this, investigated it, knew what the response was. And they're responsible for keeping this advice and guidance up to date. And if you call our call centre, you get provided with information either by email or by white mail about that fraud type. And I think it's particularly important in preventing re-victimisation, to know what's happened to you and have a strategy to make sure it doesn't happen again. Particularly as research also showed, this time by our Office of Fair Trading, that 30% of victims were re-victimised. So we wanted to reduce that amount of repeat victimisation. And lastly, unaware of their legal rights. In the UK, we have a victims code, so victims have some statutory rights around things like being informed of how the inquiry is going at particular times, and about having some aftercare, so they will be reported to our national charity called Victim Support. And we found that the police were relatively good with fraud victims in certain areas on this, but a fraud victim could be, their case could be investigated by our Serious Fraud Office, by our Financial Services Authority, by our Consumer Protection Agencies, and their rights weren't consistent. The victims code didn't kick in. So we're working on making sure wherever the victim's case is investigated, they get a consistent response. On Action Fraud, so this is a call centre we've set up, now been running just around a year, and it has a telephone call centre and a web reporting. I think quite crucially that all people who report fraud here, they get a crime reference number. So it's recorded and recognised as a crime when they call up, and then it's tracked through, and it means that it goes on our national statistics about fraud. All this information that is given goes to our National Fraud Intelligence Bureau. And as I said, a key part of this is giving advice, guidance and further support to victims. And the proof of the pudding is that we did a survey over the year of those who'd gone through this process to see how satisfied they were. 91% said they were satisfied. But more importantly, 94% of people who called up, and there's been 100,000 calls, said that they felt better able to protect themselves from fraud in the future. The other third pillar of our response has been the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau. This is managed by the City of London Police, so every night our information comes down from Action Fraud. It's based on, it brings all that intelligence and other intelligence sources in, so confirmed frauds to banks, from our consumer agencies, from our Serious Organised Crime Agency, from our credit industry fraud avoidance scheme. Brings all the confirmed frauds into one place, where we use a product by Data called NetReveal to try and find whether there are organised crime networks behind the different frauds, so whether there's a bigger fraud behind an individual complaint. And overnight this information goes into the Detica system, takes all these thousands of pieces of information, and then churns out the next day for analysts to look at whether there are links, and then to look at the Police National Computer and start building up intelligence cases.